One of the most amazing things about Christianity is that it is rooted in real, factual events. It claims that God has revealed himself through history. Most significant of all, it claims that God became a living, breathing man in Jesus. But is it true? The historicity of Christianity, apart from being really difficult to say, is the assertion that Christianity has historicity. This means historical truth, the quality of being an actual part of history as opposed to being a myth. But what's important about that? Well, here's the deal. Unless the Bible is rooted in actual historical events and facts as it claims to be, then there is no reason that Jesus, its central character, should have any bigger impact on my life or yours than the mythical Greek and Roman gods like Thor or Zeus. I was a law student at university and now I'm training to be a solicitor. Because I'm a lawyer, I love all law-related TV shows, and recently I've been watching a Netflix documentary called Making a Murderer. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's based on a real American man, Stephen Avery. This man spent 18 years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. He pleaded his innocence for the whole time that he was in prison until fresh DNA evidence showed that he was telling the truth. Shortly after his release though, Avery is arrested for a different crime, this time murder, and the rest of the series follows the trial for this crime. Now why am I telling you this? Well, because I learned some important lessons from this documentary. I learned that evidence is a powerful thing, like when fresh DNA evidence proved that Avery was in fact innocent. I learned the importance of looking at the evidence objectively. We're not going to get to the truth if we just make the evidence fit our preconceived ideas. And finally, I learnt that we need to look at the evidence as a whole, not just the one piece that is being presented to us at any one time. The key question in any investigation should be, which explanation best fits all of the evidence taken together? This show also got me thinking, what would it look like if we were to put Christianity on trial? In a trial, each side presents their own evidence and each side gets to test the evidence of the other side. Then it's over to the jury to reach a verdict. What would happen if you, the jury, were presented with the evidence for and against Christianity? Where would the evidence take you? Would Christianity stand up as being real, as being truth? At the centre of the Christian faith is Jesus. And if we're going to put Christianity on trial, then I think the key questions we need to get to the bottom of are, did Jesus exist? And if he did, was he who he said he was? In other words, was he the Son of God? I want us to consider 4 different types of evidence to see if Jesus did exist as a real man. Firstly, in a trial, some of the most compelling evidence comes from those people who were actually there when the event happened. So were there any eyewitnesses to the fact that Jesus existed as a real man? The short answer to that is yes, but I want us to dig a little deeper. The New Testament starts with what we call the 4 Gospels. These are like biographies of Jesus. They recount his life, his death, and his resurrection. But who actually wrote them? Let's start with the book of John. There's some debate over the author here. Some people think that it had several authors, and others think that it was written by the disciple John, who was one of Jesus' inner circle of 3 friends. Putting controversies aside though, if you actually read this gospel, it seems to me that it is written from the perspective of an eyewitness. Let's move on to look at the other gospels. Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples, and it's widely accepted that he wrote the book that we now call Matthew. Most people believe that Mark was written by a disciple of Peter, who himself was a disciple of Jesus. And finally, Luke was written by one of Paul's companions. And although not an eyewitness himself, Luke was a historian, a journalist of his time. He dealt in facts, so we can be pretty confident that he would have interviewed eyewitnesses to Jesus. So now we've looked at who we think wrote the Gospels, how can we be sure that the biographies that we read are the same as the ones that were actually written down? Many people are sceptical when they realise that there are no surviving fragments of any of the original Gospels. But when we're talking about ancient history, that's not exactly surprising, nor in fact rare. But here's the good news. There are more surviving fragments of the New Testament that have been found than any other ancient text. For example, there have been over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that have been found. The runner-up, Homer's Iliad, for which there are fewer than 650 manuscripts that have been found. Yet no one seems to doubt the authenticity of that ancient text. So far, the Bible, whether or not we believe in its contents, is about as reliable a historical record as we could hope to find. An eyewitness will always be more convincing if what they say is backed up by other evidence, if someone or something corroborates their story. With this in mind, is there any evidence outside of the Bible that Jesus existed as a real man? Yes, and there's quite a few examples, but here's just a couple. The 1st century historian Josephus mentions Jesus twice, and he refers to James, the brother of Jesus. The Roman historian Tacitus talks about the early Christians, the followers of Christ, and the fact that Christ was put to death under Pontius Pilate. What possible motive would these historians have had to lie about the existence of Jesus? They weren't a part of the church. They weren't trying to spread Christianity. No, they were objective observers. In fact, if you take away the Gospels for a moment, we would still know a heck of a lot about this guy Jesus. We would know that he was a Jewish teacher, that some people thought that he performed healings and exorcisms, some thought he was the Messiah. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders, and he was put to death under Pontius Pilate. And his followers, who believed that he had risen again, spread far and wide and fast. Fourthly, scientific evidence has changed the face of criminal investigations. We don't have access to DNA or forensic evidence here, but we can look at the archaeological evidence. One archaeologist, Sir William Ramsay, set out to disprove the Bible, and in particular the writings of Luke. He carefully researched all of Luke's references to places and to people, and he didn't find a single mistake, not one. In fact, he totally changes his mind, and he describes Luke as a historian of the first rank. This has to increase our confidence in Luke's reliability. And if Luke was accurate in the smaller details, what possible reason could we have for thinking that he wouldn't be accurate in the bigger, more important ones? I mentioned earlier that in a trial, each side has the opportunity to cross-examine the evidence of the other side. So it's only fair that we stop to address some of the arguments against the evidence that we've just discussed. Firstly, how can we rely on the Gospels when they weren't actually written down until decades after the events that they describe? Doesn't the gap make it more likely that the authors forgot things or that myths developed? Yes, the Gospels weren't written down straight away, but they were written down within a generation of Jesus. Eyewitnesses to Jesus would still have been alive and I'm sure ready to correct any lies or mistakes. And in historical terms, this gap is very short. This did, after all, take place in a time without computers, without Facebook, without Google, and these people were used to preserving and passing on stories by word of mouth. Secondly, why should we rely on the New Testament when it was just put together by the Catholic Church? Surely they just picked the bits they liked and excluded anything they didn't. Actually, most of the New Testament was settled in the first 2 centuries. Unfortunately, one guy, Marcion, comes along and he puts together his own heretical Bible. When the Catholic Church met to formalise the New Testament, they weren't so much creating it as dealing with this false teaching that had emerged. They were concerned with finding the most reliable and accurate documents. After a whistle-stop tour of the evidence for Jesus' existence, we turn to the question of whether he was who he said he was. The New Testament is pretty clear that Jesus is the Son of God. And in those times, claiming to be the Son of God was tantamount to blasphemy and punishable by stoning to death. The Gospel of John records the moment in Jesus' life when Jesus says, "I and the Father at one." Again, they picked up stones to stone him with. And Jesus said to them, "I have shown you many miracles from my Father. For which of these do you stone me?" "We are not stoning you for any of these," they replied, "but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God." So it was pretty clear that those who were around Jesus, especially those who opposed him, were in no doubt that he was claiming to be God. But did Jesus really die on the cross? And then did he actually rise from the dead? We're going to focus on these as the content of some shorter videos. If you've looked at the evidence and you are convinced that Jesus did exist as a real man, then you also need to decide who he was. Many scholars who don't believe in God acknowledge that Jesus did exist, but they say that he was just a moral teacher, a nice guy, but that's all. Yet C.S. Lewis paints a very different picture of how we are able to think about Jesus. He said, "I am trying to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing that we must not say." A man who was merely a man, who said the sort of things that Jesus said, could not be a great moral teacher. Instead, he would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says that he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either he was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him. You can kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. Yet let us not bring any patronising nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. Let me finish with these questions. If Jesus was mad or bad, then how come 2,000 years after his death, millions of people still follow him? If Jesus was mad or bad, then how come he is at the very centre of history? Our whole dating system centres around him. If Jesus was mad or bad, then how come throughout history people testify to having had their lives transformed by him? It's over to you, the jury, to decide.